Welcome everyone to our webinar on how teaching kids to read went so wrong, sponsored by Yale's Institution for Social and Policy Research, or ISPS for short. And we're also co-sponsoring this event with the Yale Education Studies Program. Executive Director of that program is Mira Debs, and so thank you to our co-sponsors. Before we begin, I want to recognize some of the outstanding colleagues at ISPS who help organize our events, especially Pam Green, Rick Harrison, and Kira Wishart. Thank you all so much for all the support you give to all of our events. I'm Alan Gerber, I'm Director of ISPS, and today I'm excited to provide an opportunity for you to hear some of the insights of Emily Hanford, an award-winning reporter and podcaster. I will introduce her shortly. This event is part of ISPS's Democratic Innovations Program, which is designed to identify and test ideas for improving the quality of democratic representation and governance. One of the major research priorities at ISPS is to understand governance, and a big part of governance is how well government services are provided. Education is a critical government responsibility, and so I'm very pleased that we have a chance to reflect on how we are doing at meeting this basic and essential collective responsibility. A couple of logistical matters. Emily is going to speak for 25 or 30 minutes. After she's completed her presentation, I may ask a question or two. We're then going to open things up for general Q&A that Eric Potashnik will be helping to manage, and that the event is going to run until around 5:15. So we have about 75 minutes to meet together today. I want to encourage you all to send questions for Emily at any time through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please keep your questions brief and on topic, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can. To help field questions, again, I don't know, Eric, I should introduce you a little bit. Eric is the Julius Rabinowitz Professor of Public Policy and Chair of Political Science at Brown University, and he's an award-winning author of books on a number of topics in American politics and public policy and administration. So thank you, Eric, for your help today. I also want to let everyone know that today's event is being recorded, and so we hope to be able to share the link for this video as soon as possible after the event if you'd like to watch it multiple times. So let me tell you a little about Emily. Emily Hanford is a senior correspondent and producer for American Public Media. Her work has appeared on NPR and in the New York Times, the Washington Monthly, the Los Angeles Times, and other publications. She has won numerous honors, including a DuPont Columbia University Award and the Excellence in Media Reporting on Education Research Award from the American Educational Research Association. Emily is a member of the Education Writers Association Journalist Advisory Board and was a longtime mentor for EWA's New to the Beat program. For the past several years, Emily has been reporting on early reading instruction. Her 2018 podcast episode, Hard Words, Why Aren't Kids Being Taught to Read?, won the inaugural Public Service Award from the EWA. You can find all of her reporting on reading at apmreports.org/reading, including her new podcast, which I think is a major hit, and it's compelling listening. Sold a Story: How Teaching Kids to Read Went So Wrong. And I should just finally add that I think it's very fair to say that Emily has the distinction of being a person who has really changed the national debate on a matter of importance to everyone. And that is, everyone should be so lucky as to be able to see their work have that kind of impact. And so, so it's a wonderful privilege to have Emily visiting with us today. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I've already gotten one text that says you're not in your usual office, and it's true. I'm in New Haven. I'm here in person, although it seems like we're all on Zoom, but I'm here in New Haven, and I'm really glad to be here. I've had a wonderful day so far. I met a whole bunch of students and faculty, and I'm really grateful for the invitation. So I'm just going to talk for a little while. I thought I would just tell you a little bit about myself, tell you sort of some of my story about how I got interested in this topic and some of what I have learned about reading and how it works and how kids learn to do it. Because I actually think it's really fascinating. And I think many of you maybe don't know. I certainly didn't know. So you can put up the first slide. I have some slides. This is actually just the first one is just a couple of kids in a classroom in California. And this is the goal. Happy little readers, right? And the question has always been, how does a little kid get there? Like, how does a kid learn to read? So you can go to the next slide. This is my kid. I have two kids. I have two boys. So this is my little one. And when my kids went off to school, I really didn't think about how they were going to be taught to read. I definitely didn't think about whether they were going to be taught to read. I just assumed they would. And they did without much trouble. So this is my younger one. This is a few months after he started kindergarten. And he's reading a chapter book. And I don't have any idea how he learned to do that. It just kind of seemed to happen. It was like magic. And school was actually a really good experience for this kid. He's now 20. He's a sophomore in college. And it was for my older son, too, who's a college graduate. It was for me, too. And I think the fact that school was pretty good for us had something to do with the fact that reading came pretty easily. But here's the thing that I have learned that I didn't know. Reading doesn't come easily to a lot of people. And it doesn't have to do with intelligence. There are lots of really smart people who struggle to learn how to read, and they can learn to read. They can, but they really need someone to teach them how to do it, to show them how it works. And there was this moment when I started to understand this in a way that I never had before. And it was actually here in Connecticut. It was the winter of 2016. And I was interviewing college students who had been placed in remedial reading classes. And these were students who graduated from high school. They went to college and they were told, wait a second, you're not ready for this. You're not ready for college. And the instructor in one of these classes told me about a student that she had had a lot of years earlier. Her name was Sarah. And the instructor could tell that this student was really smart and driven. And she wanted a college degree because she wanted to be a nurse. But Sarah wasn't going to be able to pass the assessment that was going to get her out of this remedial reading class. She couldn't read very well at all. She couldn't write. And the instructor ended up petitioning the English department, saying, Sarah's really bright. She needs a college degree so she can be a nurse. Let's figure out some way to assess her, get her out of this class so she can move on and get a degree. And it worked. Sarah passed the class. And then this instructor, whose name is Jill, lost track of Sarah. She thought about her sometimes. She wondered about what had happened to her. And then years later, Jill was in the hospital having surgery, and she woke up, and there was Sarah. Sarah was Jill's nurse. So when I heard this story, I thought I really want to talk to Sarah. So Jill dug up an old email address. I wrote to Sarah. Sarah wrote back to me. And in the winter of 2016, I drove to her house in Connecticut in the middle of an ice storm, and we did this long interview. And Sarah told me all about her reading problems. Now, it turns out that Sarah has dyslexia. That was not something that was ever identified when she was in school. It actually wasn't anything that was like ever officially diagnosed. It's basically what Sarah figured out about herself. And Sarah told me about all these strategies that she had to try to get through the written text. So there were a certain number of words that she had just memorized. She knew what they looked like common words she saw all the time. And then there were a lot of other words, and she would just guess them. She would look at the first letter, look at the last letter, think about something that made sense. And she told me the problem was she couldn't come up with a very good guess a lot of times. So she just skipped a lot of words. And this way of reading was really time consuming. It was hard. It was frustrating. It was confusing. She couldn't focus on the meaning of what she was reading. So really her main strategy with reading was just to avoid reading. She really didn't do it. She had this sister who was a little bit older than her who would read things out loud to her. And that's really how she got through school, how she got through high school. Then she got stuck in that remedial reading class in college. She got saved by her instructor. She eked her way through college without opening a book. She told me never. She said she never opened a book in college. And her strategy was to pay really close attention to the lecture and the class discussion. She says she has a really good memory. I believe her. And that's how she got her nursing degree. She memorized all the words that she needs to know to be able to read and write, communicate with the nurses and the doctors and the medical staff. But she really never learned how to read. And her story was really amazing to me. I had all kinds of questions after talking to her about dyslexia. First of all, I knew nothing about it, about why she was never identified with dyslexia, didn't get any help in school. So this next picture, which you're looking at, stay on this slide. I just started to dig into this question of dyslexia and learning disabilities. And there's tons of research about this. So this is just one little part of my bookshelf. These are some of the books that I started reading. So I was digging into the research about dyslexia. And then I was also talking to parents. And I was starting to hear the same story from parents all over the country. First, I was talking to parents in Maryland, where I live, and I thought, oh my gosh, Maryland has a terrible problem. And then I was talking to parents in California and Michigan and Florida, and really, literally, it was the same story over and over again. And the story is basically this: like, our kid went to school, and we knew something wasn't right. We went to the teacher, and the teacher was like, don't worry, make sure you read lots of books to him. Everything's going to be fine. But we were like, something's not right with reading here. He doesn't seem to get it. He doesn't like it. This went on for years. The parents would say, there's something wrong here. And the school was saying, don't worry, we've just got to find your kid the right book. He'll get really excited and it'll all be fine. And what eventually happens, these parents were telling me, if they had time and money, especially money's a big thing here. These parents would pay for private testing to try to figure out what was going on with their kid. And this usually costs thousands of dollars. A lot of these parents would turn to private tutoring, which is more thousands of dollars. Sometimes they'd hire a lawyer or an educational consultant or both to actually like start a fight with the school to try to get what their kid needed. And it's really expensive, really frustrating, really hard, really exhausting. And what happens is the parents begin to realize that their child isn't going to get what he needs in public school, or he's not going to get it fast enough, because now this kid is like 9, 10 years old. He hates school. He can't read very well, so he's falling behind in other subjects. Sometimes this kid is acting out in school, like maybe this has turned into a behavior problem, or maybe this is starting to manifest as like anxiety, depression, withdrawal. And this is when the parents tell me, if they have the resources, time and money, the family pulls their child out of public school. So maybe they teach them themselves. I've met a whole bunch of mothers who quit their careers to teach their children to read, to homeschool their kids. Or maybe they come up with the literally tens of thousands of dollars, like maybe even $80,000 a year at some schools around here, that it can cost to send a kid to a specialized private school. And there's a whole bunch of parts of the country where there isn't a good private school to send the kid to, even if you could get them in, even if you did have the money. So what I started to realize is that we're in this situation in this country that if you can come up with the money to pay for it, you can probably find a way for your kid to be taught how to read. But if you don't have the money and your child is not learning how to read in school, what do you do? So the equity implications of this are really stunning. If you're from a low income family, even a moderate income family, there's really no safety net here. There's no backup if you're not being taught to read in school. One mom said to me, getting help for a struggling reader is a rich man's game. So I was like, whoa, what? Reading? This is the most basic thing here. This is the foundation upon which all learning is built. So how did that happen? How was it allowed to continue? What was going on? So I did this next reporting project. You can go to the next slide. And this is what Alan mentioned, Hard Words. It's an audio documentary about core reading instruction. So first I was really interested in dyslexia. What do kids with dyslexia need? But now I was like, okay, let's not think about what struggling readers need in particular, but rather what do all children need to learn to become good readers? Like, what's up with this? How do we learn to read? And what I discovered is that there's this huge body of evidence about reading. And the bottom line from that evidence is this: decades and decades of research. What kids with dyslexia need to learn to become good readers is not substantially different from what all kids need to learn to become good readers. Like, we all need to learn the same things to become good readers. Kids with dyslexia need a certain intense dose of a certain kind of instruction, but all kids can benefit from the kind of instruction the kids with dyslexia desperately need. So I started digging into all this research about reading. So you can go to the next slide. So this is the part of my shelf of books, the slide before this. This is just questions about how do we read? How do our brains learn to do that? How do we learn? What do we need to know? What do we need to be taught? Why do some people struggle with reading? Why is learning to read really hard for some people? Because it is. It's really hard for some people. And a lot is known about this. A lot is known about reading and why kids struggle. And there's actually research that shows that different reading methods affect reading development. So different ways of teaching kids to read, you can actually see it in their brain. So you can go to the next one. This is a book that taught me so much, and I highly recommend this book, Reading in the Brain. It's not light. You can see, I don't think I've ever put so many sticky notes in a book. And there's a big takeaway from this book and from all this research. And maybe it seems kind of obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me, is that our brain is actually the product of millions of years of evolution in a world without writing, right? So as human beings, we just didn't do this reading and writing thing for a long time. So our brains actually aren't wired to do it. We're not born with brains that are wired to read. It turns out that some of us don't need to be taught that much. We don't need very much instruction, but some of us need a lot. So you can go to the next slide. This is really the book that sort of blew my mind about all of this. It was written in 2017 by a guy named Mark Seidenberg, who's a cognitive scientist at the University of Wisconsin. And it made me think a whole lot about a lot of assumptions that I didn't realize I had about reading. And here's a quote from the book by Mark Seidenberg. Reading to children rarely involves teaching them to read. The activity contributes to the child's progress, but it is not all that is required. Some children do learn to read with minimal instruction, but unlike learning to talk, it is a mistake to assume that they will. Another quote from this book is, children who are read to until the cow jumps over the moon can still have difficulty becoming readers. So this book is about that. And it's also about politics and policy and teacher preparation and what teachers learn, and really more like what they don't learn about how kids learn to read and how to teach it. It goes into the reading wars and ideas about how kids learn to read, theories about it that we've been fighting about for centuries. The Sold a Story podcast that I talked to you about before, at one point we went way back in history. Actually, we have a timeline that starts in the 1600s. And at one point we had this whole section in there where we talked about the reading wars back in the 1800s. And they were just drop down, horrible, bitter fights. And they really started because this guy named Horace Mann, who you've probably heard of, who's like the father of public education, was the first Secretary of Education in Massachusetts. And he came along with this idea. He believed in this particular method about teaching kids to read. And it was called the whole word method. And Horace Mann believed this. These are quotes from Horace Mann. Children learn to read by being in the presence of books. And then he said this, I am satisfied that our greatest error, this is Horace Mann, our greatest error in teaching children to read lies in beginning with the alphabet. No thorough reform will ever be effected in our schools until this practice is abolished. So Horace Mann did not like the idea that kids were going to be taught about the letters and the sounds that make up the words and language. He thought that was going to be tedious and boring and that it was unnecessary. In fact, this is one of my favorite quotes from Horace Mann. He said, in regard to all the other sources of pleasure, beauty, motion, music, memory, the alphabetic column presents an utter blank. There stands in silence and death the stiff perpendicular row of characters, lank, stark, immovable. They are skeleton-shaped, bloodless, ghostly apparitions, and hence it is no wonder that the children look and feel so death-like when compelled to face them. So I think it's important to recognize that one of the founders of public education felt very strongly about how to teach kids to read, and he really thought it was going to be a bad idea to start with letters and sounds, to start with phonics. He thought that was going to be bad for kids. And then the Boston schoolmasters and this guy named Samuel Green, who is the principal of the Phillips Grammar School in Boston, were listening to Horace Mann and reading things he was writing. And they were like, whoa, wait a minute, Horace, hold your horses. And they wrote this retort to Horace Mann, which is fascinating in their very 19th century way. And they wrote things like this. Reading justly deserves the first rank among the studies of our schools. As an accomplishment alone, it possesses intrinsic excellence, but considered as fundamental to other departments of learning, its value cannot be too highly estimated. So they're saying, hold on, Horace, you are talking about something critical here. You're coming up with this new idea to teach kids to read, and we don't think that this is a good idea. They said, in judging the merits of any system by which reading may be taught, remote as well as an immediate effects should be duly regarded. A child, even at the threshold of his education, should not be subjected to any delay which the formation of correct habits may require. He should never be hurried over difficulties at first concealed, yet in his progress unavoidable, simply to make his entrance into the temple of learning easy and agreeable. A system of instruction is subjected to an unworthy test when the chief excellence claimed for it consists in smoothing the path of the learner. So essentially, Horace Mann was saying, let's make this easier for kids to learn to read by not focusing on the letters and sounds and the stuff that's hard. English spelling is hard. Let's just get kids into books and words and get them right there to the end. And the Boston schoolmasters are saying, wait a second, you're going to try to make this easy at the beginning by just getting kids into books and not teaching them letters and sounds, putting the hard stuff on the side. But you are going to damage those children in the end. And no one could agree. Should you start with the way that Horace Mann was saying, sort of meaning first, whole words, whole sentences, whole stories? Or should you start with letters and sounds? A sort of bottom-up approach, emphasize decoding, right? And we fought about this forever because no one really knew. But then all this research started being done, sort of exploded in the 1970s, motivated by the question, how do kids learn to read? Like, seriously, how does that work? So you can go to the next slide. And this is something I talk about a lot. I think it's a really good place to begin because it really, really helped me understand how reading works. It's called the simple view of reading. And the simple view of reading does not say that reading is simple, really important. To the contrary, reading is actually really complicated. It's complex. But the simple view of reading is a simple model to understand a complex process. So it was first proposed a long time ago. I was in high school. It was 1986. And this model was actually proposed because these researchers were trying to clarify the role of decoding in reading comprehension because everyone was fighting about this. This was sort of when the reading wars of the late 20th century were getting into full swing. Now, everyone agrees that the goal of reading is to comprehend text. Everyone agrees on that. And the question is, how does a little kid get there? So the simple view says that reading comprehension is the product of two things, right? So one is your ability to decode the words, right? And the other part of the equation is your language comprehension. So that's your ability to understand spoken language. So we're not talking about your ability to read text. Language comprehension is your ability to understand meaning when someone is talking or when text is being read out loud to you. So for example, when someone says to you, she is reading the book, you know what the verb means in that sentence, you know what she's doing. So what the simple view says is that if you have really good language comprehension skills, but zero decoding skills, your reading comprehension will be zero. Because 0 times anything is 0. And the simple view also says that if you have really good decoding skills, but very poor language comprehension skills, you just don't know the meaning of that many words in spoken language, your reading comprehension will not be very good either. So here's why this is important. Most kids entering school have very little when it comes to the decoding part of the equation, right? They have 0 or close to 0 when it comes to the D in the simple view of reading. But they do have something when it comes to the language comprehension part of the equation. So when kids enter school, they know the meaning of lots of words if they're English speakers in America, but they don't know how to decode those words yet, right? So this is why people familiar with the science of reading, so-called, call for an emphasis on decoding instruction in the early grades. Because if the end goal here is to try to get your reading comprehension, and you have a bunch of 5- and 6-year-olds who are sitting in front of you, they have language comprehension skills, but they really have virtually no decoding skills, you need to help those children develop decoding skills. But, and this is so important, the simple view clearly shows that focusing only on decoding would be a very, very big mistake because it's only part of the equation. And this is really important. Kids come into school with very different language comprehension skills, right? Some kids know the meaning of lots and lots of words. Some kids have far smaller vocabularies. Some kids are speaking little or no English. So reading instruction that aligns with the simple view has to focus on this language comprehension part of the equation too. So I was in this first grade classroom where reading instruction was deliberately aligned with this simple view. And what I saw was phonics instruction in one part of the reading instruction, and the kids were broken into small groups depending on the level of their decoding skills. And then in another part of the reading instruction, they were getting explicit vocabulary lessons and lots of reading out loud by the teacher. And the words that the kids had learned were posted on cards all over the classroom. They were words like extraordinary and ridiculous and neighborly, which are not words that the vast majority of first graders are going to be able to decode. They shouldn't be expected to. But the first graders in this class were learning the pronunciation and meaning of those words so that when they're able to decode them, they'll know what the words mean. And this is really important. Every single child in that class spoke English as a second language. And for some kids, English was their third language. So this simple view was proposed as a model back in 1986. And then the basics of this model have been confirmed over and over again by research since. And I think it's really helpful because it disentangles some of the stuff that's really contentious in the debates about reading and has been for decades, for centuries, right? So when what's known as the whole word, which sort of became the whole language, which is now more recently called balanced literacy. So in the whole language balanced literacy view, the focus right from the start of reading instruction should be on getting kids to focus on the meaning of what they're reading. That's what Horace Mann wanted. Whole language and balanced literacy are meaning emphasis approaches to reading instruction. Get kids to focus on the whole, the meaning, as opposed to what's known as a code emphasis approach, which emphasizes decoding skills at the beginning of reading instruction, right? So early reading instruction that aligns with the scientific research over the past 50 years is a code emphasis approach, not only, but emphasizing so that kids can get to meaning, because everyone agrees that meaning is the goal. And the question again is, how does a little kid get there? So in my reporting, what I became very interested in trying to figure out is how are kids being taught in school? That's what I started to dig into next. So let me just tell you a little bit about what I learned. You can go to the next slide. This is just one little artifact here. It was sent to me by a mom in Massachusetts. It came home in her son's backpack. And these are all strategies for kids to use when they're learning to read and they come to a word that they don't know. And here's the thing, these strategies make sense. They seem totally sensible. You get to a word you don't know, what can you do? Well, you can look at the picture to try to figure out what the word might be. You don't want to completely guess, so you can look at the first letter, like Sarah did, for example. You can look at some of the letters. It's going to narrow your choices, help you come up with a good guess. You can then check. You can see if you were right. Reread the sentence using the word, see if the sentence makes sense. Maybe you were right. If you're really stuck, you can just skip the word and move on. Skip. Hopefully you can get the gist of the sentence anyway. So what I was trying to understand is I was seeing stuff like this all over the place, like on postcards, on bookmarks. There are these little cartoon characters that have versions of these strategies. This was everywhere in American schools. I was seeing it in classrooms that I was visiting. I was getting sent it. Parents were telling me about it. And I was like, what is this about? What is the idea about how reading works that these strategies are based on? That's what I wanted to get interested in. And that's what I started to try to figure out. So you can go to the next slide. It turns out that these ideas are based in a theory about reading that's been around for a long time, that's come to be known sort of more recently as cueing. Not everyone uses that term. But the idea is that readers use different kinds of information or cues or clues to identify the words as they're reading. And this was sort of articulated as a theory back in the 1960s. And it was sort of a big deal. It was a big deal in the research area when this theory came out. And the basic idea behind this cueing theory, remember, this is the 1960s. We really didn't know how people read yet. The theory here is that readers don't have to sound out written words to know what they are. They can, right? They can sound out the words, but they don't have to because they can use other strategies to figure out the words. They can do things like look at the first letter of a word, use the context, think of a word that makes sense, look at the pictures. They can essentially predict the words as they're reading. The problem is, this is not the way that skilled readers do it. This is not the way that skilled readers read. So you can go to the next slide. I did this reporting project in 2019 where I got really interested in this cueing theory and how this theory and the word reading strategies based on this theory became foundational in reading curriculum, reading assessments, and reading intervention programs that are very popular in American schools that say they use a balanced literacy approach to teaching reading. And surveys show that most schools, at least until recently, said they used a balanced literacy approach. Cueing is at the foundation of that balanced literacy approach, but this cueing theory, as I said, isn't right. It's not how skilled reading works. Cognitive scientists showed this back in the 1970s and 80s. Skilled readers, when you're a good reader, you do not use cues and context to identify words as you're reading. In fact, this is the amazing thing. What scientists figured out is that this is how poor readers read, right? Struggling readers often have a hard time with word identification. Too many of the words that they come across are kind of like little mysteries, little series of letters that they don't know and they can't quite figure out. So, like Sarah, they have all these other strategies that they use to try to figure out what the words say, right? And often they don't like reading. They just get a gist of the reading, they guess and skip and use context. This is not what reading is like when you're a skilled reader. What cognitive scientists have figured out is that this really is the key difference between skilled readers and unskilled readers. Skilled readers can immediately and accurately recognize words. They don't need to guess or predict or use the context. And skilled readers, once you're a skilled reader, if you're a skilled reader, you actually know tens of thousands of words in a split second, like instantly on sight. In fact, if you're a skilled reader, your brain has gotten so good at reading words that you process the word book faster than you process a picture of a book, which is really amazing because remember, your brain was not designed to do it. So how did your brain get so good at that? So I'm just going to take another couple of minutes to explain another couple key concepts, and then we're going to move on to questions. But it happens through this process called orthographic mapping. And I think it's really key to understand a little bit about orthographic mapping to understand why teaching kids how to decode words is so important, why phonics is important, and why teaching kids the cueing strategies is not a good idea. So yes to phonics, no to the cueing strategies. So here's a quick and simplified explanation of orthographic mapping. It's basically the process that we use to store printed words in our long-term memory. And here's how you do it. You attend closely to how a written word is spelled, and you link that sequence of letters to the word's pronunciation and meaning. So it's three things: the spelling, the pronunciation, and the meaning. So for a very simple example, a little kid knows the meaning and pronunciation of the word cat, and the written word cat gets orthographically mapped to her memory when she links the sounds cat to the written word cat. So that requires an awareness of the speech sounds and words. That's called phonemic awareness. It requires an understanding of how those sounds are represented by letters. That's phonics. So you need good phonics and phonemic awareness to orthographically map words into your memory. And once a word has been orthographically mapped to your memory, you know it instantly on sight. In fact, you cannot suppress your ability to read the word. It's fascinating. You don't have to consciously sound out the word when you see it, but you know the word in a split second because at some point, maybe when you were like 8 years old or 5 years old, at some point you successfully sounded the word out and you linked the spelling of the word in your mind with the meaning and the pronunciation of that word. So by about second grade, a typically developing reader who has good phonics skills needs just a few exposures to a word through its pronunciation, its spelling, and its meaning, and bam, the word is mapped to her memory. The more words that you map to your memory this way, the more you can focus on the meaning of what you're reading. You're not using your brain power to identify the words. You're using your brain power to understand what you're reading. And that's the goal, right? For readers to understand what they are reading. But when teachers use that cueing system, when they teach all those word reading strategies, they're actually impeding that orthographic mapping process. So you can go to the next slide. I'm just going to tell you this one little story and then wrap up. So these are first graders in Oakland, California. And a literacy coach who worked with these girls came to see that teaching the cueing strategies was actually making it harder for many of her students to learn how to read. The coach's name is Margaret Goldberg. She was hired by the Oakland Unified School District back in 2015 to teach a program called Level Literacy Intervention. LLI is a reading intervention program that does include some phonics instruction, because remember, one of the cues for figuring out a word is to use the letters. But LLI is rooted in that idea, that foundational idea in balanced literacy, that letters are one way to figure out a word. So kids are also taught that when they come to a word they don't know, they can use pictures and context to try to come up with a guess. So Margaret started teaching this LLI program. And then at about the same time, she found this bunch of unopened materials sitting on a shelf in her school which you'll find all over America and is part of the problem. And it was a systematic phonics program and phonemic awareness. And it teaches kids that when they come to a word they don't know, they sound it out, and it does not include any of the cueing stuff. And in this program, beginning readers practice reading in decodable books that contain words with spelling patterns they've been taught, so they don't have to guess at the words. They don't have to use that strategy. So Margaret started teaching some of her groups of students LLI with the cueing, and some she taught this systematic phonics and phonemic awareness program with no cueing. And she started to notice differences between the two groups of kids, not just in how well they were reading, but in the way they approached their reading. So she and a colleague recorded first graders talking about what makes them good readers. So this is a video. We're going to play it for you. Mia is in the white shirt. She was learning phonics and no cueing. And Jabria is in the pink jacket. She was taught the cueing system. So you can play the slide.
Yes. What makes you good readers?
I learn a lot. Because I look at the pictures and I read it.
Ooh. Do you remember when you were little and you didn't know how to read?
Yes.
Uh-oh.
Like when you started
Kinda.
kindergarten?
Yeah.
What helped you learn how to read? How did you learn?
By looking at the pictures.
Anything else?
Looking at the words and sounding them out.
So Margaret was seeing this over and over again in these two groups of kids. Like one group of kids was taking away this idea from reading instruction, the idea that reading is about looking closely at words and sounding them out. And the other group of kids was learning that when you come to a word you don't know, you don't have to look carefully at the word and try to connect the spelling with the pronunciation and the meaning. Instead, you can look away from the word. You can look at the pictures. You can look at the other words in the sentence, search around for clues to help you identify the word. But remember that orthographic mapping process requires you to look carefully at the words so your brain links the spelling with the sounds and the meaning. And this cueing stuff teaches kids to actually look away from the words. So what Margaret Goldberg said to me about the kids in her LLI groups was this: I did lasting damage to these kids. It was so hard to ever get them to stop looking at a picture to guess what a word would be. It was so hard to ever get them to slow down and sound a word out because they had had this experience of knowing that you predict what you read before you read it. So you can go to the next slide. This sort of tees up the Sold a Story podcast, which is really my effort to figure out why. How did it happen that this idea became so predominant in American schools? Not just in American schools, but in schools in other parts of the English-speaking world too. Like I said, we had this unbelievable timeline that started in 1649. It has 2019 entries as of yesterday. And it is about one idea. The idea is kids don't need to sound out written words because they have other ways to know what they are. They can sound out the words, but they don't have to. The whole thing is about what's wrong with that idea and how that idea came to dominate in American schools and the damage that idea has done. 6 episodes, 4.5 hours, that's it. The debate about how to teach children to read has long been about phonics and has been understood to be about phonics. And getting reading instruction right, though, is not just about adding phonics instruction. It's about taking away that cueing theory. And I think most importantly, helping teachers understand what's wrong with that theory. And I think you do that by helping them learn how to read. And when teachers really do learn how kids learn how to read, then they sit there and it sort of falls apart on its own. This whole cueing theory, they're like, why did I do that? And we can get into a little bit of that in the conversation. But I'll just tell you a few things about the reaction to Sold a Story. It's had lots of listeners. I think it's 5.3 million listeners so far. Lots of people who aren't educators, who aren't the parents of struggling readers. That was really one of my goals. I said to my editor early on, like, I really want the moms of the kids who aren't struggling to write to me and say, I listened and I care about this and I want to do something about it. And that is what's happening. I think the parents of struggling readers have felt alone for a long time, and they're finding each other, and there's more of them than you realize. And I think this is something that all of us need to care about, even people who learned how to read easily in spite of how they were taught. Another thing that Sold a Story has done is that legislators in at least 15 states have introduced some kind of bill to overhaul reading instruction since it came out. There was a big wave of legislative effort going on before that. So this has really been happening over the past several years. And I think a lot of it has to do with parent advocacy. But one of the things that's happening now in these bills is that a lot of them are focused on curriculum, and some of them are specifically focused on banning curriculum that includes this queuing idea. At last count, as of yesterday, there were 10 states at least that have introduced some kind of queuing ban, which I have some mixed feelings about, which we can talk about. I mean, the point of this podcast was that this idea is debunked and harmful, and breaking its decades-long hold on education system is really important. But these bans make me anxious. When you take something away, everyone's suddenly looking for something new. I'm worried about there's a sort of a rush to buy new things. I don't think buying something new is the answer. I don't think a new curriculum is going to solve all the problems, because at the end of the day, this is really about teacher knowledge. Teachers teach kids. Curriculum don't teach kids. And banning this queuing stuff is taking place at a time when lots of other books are being banned. So I think there's a danger here that this could all get caught up and corrupted by partisan politics. And we tried this once before in America, and it did get caught up and I think sort of killed by partisan politics. So I think I'm going to skip the rest of the stuff I was going to say, because I think I've talked too long and I would really love to get to your questions. So I'll just wrap up there, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Okay, thank you so much, Emily. That was great, and I want to say also the podcast, it's super educational and also really interesting. And I think you really breathe a tremendous amount of life into the science of reading and phonics and orthographic mappings and things like that. I'm not surprised that millions of people have listened to your podcasts and that it's had the impact that it's had. I want to remind our participants, please ask questions. When will you get the opportunity to ask Emily Hanford a question? Well, now is when you'll have that opportunity. So please send your questions, and then Eric Potashnik is gonna filter those and turn them into maybe groups of questions and things like that for Emily. But let me ask Emily a question following up on what you said at the end of your presentation about the politics. As you mentioned, there's this big wave of legislation right now, and it's doing, as you said, all sorts of things. It's promoting phonics. It's in some cases, I guess, restricting the use of queuing. That's fairly detailed, I would say, for legislation. We've had a moment in the United States, the No Child Left Behind experience, I think, which is what you were alluding to. In 2002, a bill passed under George Bush, but it was a bipartisan bill. I think it had like almost 90 votes in the U.S. Senate, almost maybe 380 or something like that in the House.
Unheard of in today's times. Yes.
Yeah, right. So big bipartisan thing. When I think about it, I think I may be misremembering, but I think I even remember like Ted Kennedy standing next to George Bush when they signed this bill. You know,
definitely. It has been
right.
photographed.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. Okay. And then the Reading First program that came out of the No Child Left Behind bill was sort of aimed at the idea of promoting scientifically based reading approaches. And so this had a real head of steam. This was based on a national assessment of where the science of reading was. And it was very far along and very close to what you're describing. This effort was, kind of ran off the rails, I would say. Within half a decade or so, it began to, ran off the rails. What lessons do you draw from that experience? What cautions are you led to want to kind of remark on, and what is our takeaway from that lesson? What's your takeaway from that experience to help us avoid getting into a kind of turning what really is something that I think everyone could really get behind as the initial coalition behind the No Child Left Behind Act suggests, that what could turn this into a partisan thing and lead to some of the promise that we see in this initial legislative wave sort of not being realized.
Yeah. Well, certainly for a lot of people out there, it's a little bit deja vu all over again. Like what's happening now, they're like, wait a minute, didn't we do this before? So, and I'll say a couple of things. Number one, I'm convinced from all the work that I've done that what's happening now wouldn't be happening if reading first hadn't happened, in both a positive and a negative way. So one thing that I think is true, so Reading First was a basically $6 billion effort. It was about $1 billion. So we taxpayers invested a lot of money in trying to get the so-called science of reading into schools. It's really very similar to what's happening today, because essentially it was motivated by scientists and policymakers recognizing that there was this big gap between research and practice, and we knew a lot from research, and we just needed to get this into schools. And if we could just get this into schools and get the right materials into teachers' hands, we could make a big difference. I think what's happening now is benefiting from that, because in every school and every school system, there are some people who really lives were changed by Reading First. Like they really did learn something about how kids learn to read. To do that, or there's a base of knowledge there. So there is within our system where there's a lot of turnover and all that, there's still a base of knowledge from a generation ago now practically. And so I don't think what's happening now would be happening if we hadn't sort of established that baseline and all the research that was done at that point. I think the other thing that happened, I really think, is that we had a reaction to Reading First. So a lot of what's happened in the years since, I think we had a decade of really like swinging really far in a different direction. There were a number of things that people didn't like about the No Child Left Behind bill. There were a number of things in there that I think even the people who made the bill recognized were mistakes, right? So I think that there was a lot of reaction against that. There was a lot of political reaction against the Bush administration, the Republicans. We went from a Republican administration to a Democratic administration. There were a lot of things going on here, but I think mistakes were made during Reading First. I think there was, I think a lot of it was very top down in nature. And I think that's a very important lesson now. And I think that's why we're at a fragile moment right now, because I think a lot of the conversation about the science of reading right now has been coming from the bottom up. It's been a lot of parent advocacy, teachers too, saying, hey, we have a problem here. We need to fix this problem. And they've been sort of looking up and saying, like, we need help from our principals, from our superintendents, from our state legislators. And in some cases, they were responding, but in other cases, they're saying like, hey, we need something, we need help here. And now that's happening. So now we're starting to get a very much of a top down. I think good policy, I think for the political scientists on the call, I think ultimately good policy comes from some really delicate balance between these two things. So I think we're in the midst of that right now. But I think it's important I think there were some things that were heavy-handed and too top-down about Reading First. So I think we need to be careful about top-down stuff. But again, top-down is because people below need the help. I think that Reading First got the story about Reading First, and I think this actually happened in practice in a lot of places, is that it sort of focused too much on the decoding part. One of the reasons I decided to give you that whole explanation about how kids learn to read is I want you to understand that this is not just about phonics, right? That language comprehension part is huge. I want people to understand that you can't just add phonics because that's not enough. And you can't just add phonics without taking away the stuff that isn't right about the whole language theory. So I think in Reading First time writ large, we probably just didn't do enough of the work on the language comprehension, and the cueing stuff didn't go away. We didn't actually lose the adherence to the basic beliefs in the whole language approach. And I think maybe now, maybe the conversation about this and the research itself is sort of becoming more nuanced and sophisticated, that I'm hopeful that we might be at a good moment. And I'll say one last thing about the politics. I do think that Reading First became associated with, because it was a George Bush, it was a Republican, and phonics has always been seen as sort of traditional and conservative and old-fashioned. And as soon as that got associated with phonics and the George Bush administration, it was easy to dismiss if you were progressive, if you were liberal or whatever. It was like, push that away. What I'm hoping is going to mediate it now is that this is really important to a lot of people who have a very, very wide set of political beliefs. So if you just look at my Twitter feed, it's got people on the far left and people on the far right and everywhere in between. And I love that. I love that there is that wide swath of people who are really interested in this. So I hope that what will happen here is that if it starts to get taken by one party or another, that there'll be a force being like, no. If you over here on the far right want to take this as your issue, I'm not going to let you do that. I'm over here on the far left, and this issue is mine too. Same thing. Someone gets very far left about this. No, this is my issue too. I'm hoping that that's what's going to happen, but it's possible I'm being too optimistic.
Great. Well, thanks again. Thank you for that response, Emily. And again, thank you for such an engaging talk. We have a bunch of questions, and again, I want to encourage people. We have a bunch of questions, and I hope we'll get to a bunch more. So please ask your questions. With that, I want to turn it over to Eric Potashnik, who has been processing the question flow.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And we received lots of comments from people who said that Emily's podcast was amazing, and I certainly will echo that. It is a phenomenal experience to listen to it, and so encourage everyone to do that. So one of the questions, Emily, was about your podcast, and where Lucy Calkins referenced classroom literacy practices in the 70s and 80s as the antithesis of exciting and beautiful. And so the question is one of the reasons why science of reading wasn't getting much traction was its image problem, that there was an impression that classroom practices associated with it are kind of boring and are not going to stimulate children. How important do you think that dimension was to why it didn't gain more traction in schools around the country?
Yes, I think that is a good observation. I think that is definitely part of, I think that the science of reading did and maybe still does have a little bit of an image problem. I will also say that I think it's really important when people are talking about something that's boring to think about who is it boring for. I think in some cases, this stuff is boring for the adults, but not necessarily boring for the children. If you are in a classroom where kids are really learning how to read and cracking the code, they're pretty excited about that. And I think some of us can even remember, I know people can remember those moments where it clicked for them, where they were finally reading. It's an incredibly powerful and exciting thing for a child to begin to learn how to read. It's really just like a big life moment. And I think that a lot of what we know is that there's a significant amount of just details that kids need to understand and repetition and practice that can look boring and rote from the outside. But if it's effective, if it is getting kids to where they need to be, remember the question I kept asking, how does a little kid get there? And the question is, you're not going to love reading. It's not going to be a joyful, beautiful experience if you can't do it. And it is not a joyful, beautiful experience for a lot of kids in a lot of classrooms where they're really being expected to figure out a lot of this stuff on their own. They're being given sort of big, broad instruction and some strategies to figure out the words. And it all adds up for some kids, but for a lot of kids, it doesn't add up. And again, I want to go back to the equity issue here. There are some kids who get the help they need outside of school, but there are a lot of kids who don't. And so we're really, I think, dramatically widening gaps, opportunity gaps very early on in education when we don't teach kids directly and explicitly the things we want them and need them to know.
Great. Another question, here's a two-parter, and that is, are there particular phonics or decoding programs that the experts who study the science of reading advocate, that really identify and say, these are the best practices? And then secondly, what would be the advice you would offer to somebody who finds that the schools, perhaps the schools their children are in, is resistant to moving away from the cueing curriculum? What kinds of advocacy strategies you're finding are most effective on the ground?
So the first question about programs I get all the time, and I'm reluctant to answer that. Number one, I'm not hiding anything. I don't really even know if I know the answer to that, right? But I think people's immediate question is, well, what do I buy? What do I need to get? And I always want to tell everyone, like, hold on, let's make sure you really understand what you want, what you're looking for. So I do think there are some places that really do lay out what are the kinds of things you want to see in a curriculum. And I think those are important. There's an organization called the Reading League, and they do have like some rubrics where you can go through and evaluate curriculum. There are some entities that actually evaluate curriculum. There are some states that are starting to do that. I mean, Massachusetts is nearby. They're starting to have their own system where it's called Curate, where they're going through and looking at curriculum. And I think they're really looking at it with the sort of science of reading in mind. There are some other organizations that do it that more look at whether or not they kind of align with the Common Core standards, which isn't exactly the same as looking at whether they really align with the science of reading, but Ed Reports is an organization that does that. So I think it's important to ask, just know what questions to ask of a curriculum. So I know that's maybe an unsatisfying answer, but also as a journalist, I never want to endorse products anyway. On the question, I hear this all the time from parents who are concerned and are getting resistance from their schools. And I would say find the other parents who have the same questions and concerns you have, because they're there. And so find them. And it's so much better to go to the school with more than one of you. Not, and I also think many parents have gone to the school with these questions, and it's just them sort of against the school. I mean, they literally walk into a meeting and there's like 8 people and them, and they get sort of this edgy speak that they don't understand. And then they leave feeling like they're in an alternate reality. And it's like, I think my kid is having trouble reading, but they're telling me all this stuff and I don't understand what they're saying. And they're saying it's not a problem. And I know that it is. So find the other parents who are trying to ask questions and go with them. And I guess take advantage of the moment, because I think there is a growing awareness of this. And so there's now a lot of resources, not just the reporting I've done, but there's a tremendous amount of stuff that's been written that's really easy to digest and read and pass around. There are teachers who are writing really great blogs. There are cognitive scientists who are starting to really learn how to translate this into practice. I think that's part of the problem too. It still is. Research into practice is very difficult. It takes a long time for research to get into practice, and where the science of reading is really well established, I think it's well established and well tested that we have like lots of great curriculum out there that we know really work. We don't, because part of the problem is that balanced literacy has been so predominant. It's really what the market wanted. It's what all the publishers were creating. It's what people were buying. So there's not a huge number of options when it comes to stuff that's better aligned with the science of reading. So I think we're in a moment now where the market's shaking out. We're going to see a lot of products get revised. We're going to see new products out there. And I think some of these things will be good and they need to be tested. And a lot of them haven't been tested yet.
Great. We received a couple of questions about people wanted to know how the lessons apply to particular groups of students who might have special needs. So, for example, multilingual students or students who lack a rich vocabulary. Are there any ways in which the findings of this research suggest that teaching should be modified for those groups, or are what you're finding that it works for all groups of students?
Well, again, it's one of the reasons why I spend time on that simple view of reading, because I think if you even just think about those questions and then think about the simple view of reading, you can kind of find your answer, right? So there are 2 big things that are involved in beginning to reading comprehension: your decoding ability, your ability to read those written words, and your language comprehension. So you clearly have some kids, for example, a kid who doesn't speak English, who's going to need a lot more on the language comprehension side. They're just going to need a heavy dose of that. And they are not going to do well in a classroom that is not providing a good base of that, and where they're even getting more help, right? So you want lots of conversation, lots of reading out loud, lots of talking, lots of oral language. But they need the decoding too. There's no difference. They still need to learn how to decode those written words. It's just that they, if you think about it, they don't have the benefit of the oral language ability in that moment that it clicks. Like, oh yeah, I know that word. They might be learning the meaning of the word at the same time. Same thing for kids who just might not have a lot of vocabulary, right? And this is why getting that part of it is so important. What is actually really kind of crazy about all this is teaching kids how to read the words is arguably the easy part. and that's the part that we've really been getting wrong and we've been arguing about for so long, that is actually arguably easier than all the rest of it. The language comprehension, the knowledge, all that stuff that it takes to comprehend what you read requires years of schooling and is particularly susceptible to differences in background, right? So what you know, the words you know isn't just what you learn in school. In fact, most of what you learn is just in your daily life. What's going on in your home? Who are you getting a chance to talk to? What are the things you're getting exposed to? All of that kind of stuff. So really like equalizing things on the language comprehension side is more difficult. We will probably always see that reading comprehension is associated with family background and sort of opportunities for language comprehension. But I would just keep going back to the simple view of reading. Again, it doesn't say reading is simple. It's a simple view, a simple way to understand a complex process, but I think it helps disentangle what does a second language learner need? What does a kid who doesn't have a huge vocabulary need? All that kind of stuff.
We also received, a cognitive science question, and that is somebody wanted to know whether you could compare the process that goes on in the brain with learning to read music. Is that similar or different?
I can't answer that question. I certainly know that learning to read music is used often as a metaphor in terms of the question of the explicit instruction that one needs to learn to read music. Whether or not like literally how that goes on in the brain, I don't know, but I think that's fascinating.
And then a follow-up is there a parallel to the science of reading to math instruction? Do you know anything about the state of our efforts to provide evidence-based math instruction in the schools today?
Well, I showed you that book, Reading in the Brain, and that guy, Stanislas, and I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, he's French, but it's Dehaene. The first book he wrote, maybe it's not the first book, but before he wrote that book about reading the brain, he wrote a book about math. I'm forgetting what's called at the moment. And I would say, so yes, there is a lot of research about math and how we learn math and how that works in the brain. And I think that math instruction suffers from some of the same problems that reading instruction has. And it has to do with with a sort of resistance in American education generally to sort of explicit and direct instruction. I would say the sort of emphasis in instruction has more been on individual learning on your own, discovering things for yourself, a more progressive approach, which I think is wonderful. Like that's what I wanted for my kids when my kids were little, for sure. But I really think that it leaves a lot of kids behind. There are things that we can explicitly and directly teach to kids that we should be, and it doesn't have to be rote, old-fashioned, boring, abusive, any of these, whatever these ideas are that people have in their head about that. It doesn't have to be done that way. It's not being done that way. There are lots of schools where this kind of instruction is being done really well. But I think that math and reading suffer from the same idea that somehow we don't want to explicitly teach little children things, that we want them to discover it on their own, that we think that that's better. The cognitive science research does not show that to be true, not better, and not more efficient. And efficiency matters here. Efficiency really matters with reading because it's a multiplicative, it's an exponential thing, right? So you start to get good at reading and you get better and better and better at it by reading. And the kids, you just spiral up. There's this thing called the Matthew effect in reading, right? The rich get richer, and it happens really fast. Kids who get off to a good start in reading like reading and then do it more and like it more and get better at it and do it more. And most of what you know about language and the vocabulary and the knowledge comes from reading. So if you get off to not a good start with reading, it's frustrating, it's hard, but you don't like it, you resist it, you are falling so far behind, not because you're falling behind, you're just like slightly getting a little, like you're going like this and your peers are going like this. This is the achievement gap in America right here.
Emily, I'm sorry. Could I just follow up just quickly on the math point, because that seems I'm wondering, I don't know, is there a parallel podcast to be made about math instruction that, here's really here's what we're doing in the schools, and here's a narrative about why it happened and why it makes sense.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I think someone else should do it because I have a whole bunch of things I still want to do about reading.
No, I hear you, but what I mean is there the same level, but not yet surfaced to this degree, the same level of scientific foundation for thinking about how we teach basic numeracy that hasn't yet filtered into to the teacher training and instruction, please?
Yes, I think that, yes, I do. I think that is the case. Yes. Wow.
That's breaking. I'm not a journalist, but that strikes me as somewhat noteworthy, actually. And you're pretty sure that yeah.
Well, I don't think I don't know that there's quite the same level. Again, I'm not an expert in that area.
Yeah.
Some about it. So I don't know that there's the same level or amount of research. And I don't think, well, I was just going to say there hasn't been the equivalent of a national reading panel, but that's actually not true. There have been some big synthesis reports about math instruction. So yes, I actually think this is really a story that needs to be dug into.
Well, fortunately, there's a number of people in the audience, maybe.
Journalism students
take on that challenge.
Journalism
Thank you very much.
Soon to be Yale grads. Go for it.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
So there are a number of questions, I think, of people just really trying to understand what this really means in practice for their children. Perhaps they've already been exposed to cueing approaches. So one question was, is exposure to rhyming books, is that okay? Another one, is it okay if young readers memorize sight words in addition to sounding out words? Is that effective as long as they're not looking at pictures as cues? People are really, I think, trying to understand, how do I know if my child, if somebody I care about is learning correctly, and when should I be concerned that they're being taught in a way that might undermine their development as effective readers?
Yeah, I mean, it's true that I think when you point out these things, it makes a lot of sense that people get very anxious and nervous about it. I will say one thing. So lots of kids are very resilient, right? Lots of kids really, they can be taught this cueing stuff and they will figure out that the sounding out part, that one cue, that's the best, most effective, most efficient, most accurate way to know the words. And they get that and they start doing that. I have to say that I've talked to a lot of tutors, reading tutors who work with middle school and high school kids. Sometimes this stuff really reveals itself when kids are first taking the ACT and the SAT, because it's a huge amount of reading really fast. And that's when some of those reading problems really get revealed for the first time to parents. And they take them to tutoring, and the tutors say that breaking these habits are really hard. And they have to really work on breaking the habit first. And this cueing stuff is stuff that you don't even necessarily need to be taught. It's what a lot of readers will come up with on their own in the absence of being taught how to read the words, and they can't figure it out. That said, kids are resilient. I think human beings are very responsive to good instruction. So I think good instruction really can and does work, and works at all ages. I've talked to a number of adults who really were subliterate into their 40s and 50s and got some good instruction and really were able to read. Rhyming books are fantastic. There's all kinds of things that if you think about, rhyming books are really about language and the facility with language and understanding words. And those are really good and fine. Do you want that to be what you're using when you're trying to teach kids how to decode words? No, because it's going to be too easy for them to get them based on the rhyme, right? So it depends. It's for what purpose? There are certain books and certain activities for certain purposes. On the question of memorizing words, so no, I think that one of the things we really do know is that whole idea of just flashcards, memorize the words. It's not the most efficient and effective way to learn the words. Is it going to be damaging to all kids? Absolutely not, because some of those kids really are teaching themselves the code through that. They're memorizing the words, they're putting together the spelling, the sound of the meaning, and it's making sense. But that is not a good sign if what your kid is being asked to do in school is just memorize a lot of words, because that is actually not the best, most efficient way to store them in your long-term memory. Now, again, some kids really are teaching themselves, and they can use these pattern books and they can be taught the cueing strategies and all of that exposure. They put it together and they're good. It's almost like magic, like my kids.
So I'll ask a question myself, if that's okay. So thanks to your amazing podcast and parental advocacy, we are seeing more and more states that are trying to promote science of reading and to eliminate cueing strategies and to be effective. But of course, at the end of the day, this still actually has to happen in the classroom. Teachers have to change in some cases the way they've been teaching for many years. How difficult is that? How much professional development is required? How many hours of training? What are the challenges to actually, if a state has already made a commitment, they've listened to your podcast, the parents came to the school board, they said, we absolutely want to do this. How hard will it be to go from that commitment at a policy level to actually making sure this happens in classrooms consistently over the long run?
Hard. I think it's going to be very hard, and I really worry about that. I mean, it's going to be very hard because this is a really big amount of knowledge, amount for teachers to learn. There are a lot of things they need to unlearn along the way. I'll just sort of report on what teachers have told me. Like, I hear from teachers all the time, and it's almost like these stages of grief about this. Like, often they resist at first, like, oh, no, that can't be. I've been teaching kids this way. And, a lot of them are doing fine. And a lot of them were doing fine, right? Because a lot of kids do fine, depending on where you are, right? You might have most of the kids in your class are fine no matter how you teach. In other places, you might have a lot more kids. So many teachers, though, have been like, I had a gut level feeling that something wasn't right. And a lot of times they blame themselves. I wasn't doing it well enough. I wasn't doing a good enough job. So I'm going to work really hard. I'm going to go to more professional development. I'm really going to do this. They work hard, do everything they're supposed to do. And a lot of the kids still aren't learning. So what do? Oh, well, it must be the kids. They're not working hard enough. They're lazy. They're not trying hard enough. Oh, maybe he has a reading disability. Oh, her mother didn't read to her enough at home. Poor girl, she doesn't have enough books in her home. And so when teachers start to learn about this, they start to realize, oh my God, I was blaming myself. I was blaming the families. I was blaming the kids, but there was all this stuff I didn't know. And now I have a huge amount I need to know. And so, a lot of teachers are making investments of a huge amount of their time, and in some cases their money, to go learn this stuff. And it is, teaching is a hard job. We ask so much of our teachers. The work conditions are great. We don't pay them enough. This is not easy. There are plenty of teachers who are resisting this for good reason. And one of the reasons they're resisting it is I have heard you telling me before that this is the new thing I have to learn and the new thing I have to do, and I'm not interested. I'm going to close my door and do what I've always been doing. And in some cases, what they've always been doing is great. They figured this out long ago and were teaching when they were trying to resist all the fads and all the things going on. Unfortunately, we'd love to be able to tell teachers, close your doors and just make your own professional decisions. But so many teachers haven't learned what they need to know about how kids learn to read, and they're recognizing that. So I think this is a really, really big challenge. I guess I will just say I'm hopeful at the moment, because I think there are a lot of people out there who are really committed to it, because it's so important.
Emily, I just want to say one of the participants recommended a web, I don't know what it is, it's a website, I guess, or Chalk and Talk with an ampersand.
Yeah.
Anna Stokey on mathematics education.
On math. Okay.
Yeah. And I just wanted to know, are there any sources that you turn to or that you find especially interesting, any internet websites that you would say someone who wants to know more about this that you would recommend they turn to?
Yeah, sure. If you go to the Sold a Story webpage, which is soldastory.org, there's a reading list there, and I just put 10 things on it. I literally could have put 100, but if you start with those 10 things, you can go down a rabbit hole for the rest of your life if you want to, if you just follow the footnotes. There's one paper on there that has 250 references or something, so you'll be good.
Fantastic. We're coming to the end of our time. So are there any sort of observations or anything you'd like to say, kind of to round out our discussion?
Wow. Okay. Well, thanks for being interested in this. I know people are interested in it for a bunch of different reasons. And so I appreciate whatever reason you bring to the table, whether it's your own child, whether you're a teacher and are trying to learn better, whether you're a student who wants to become a teacher or go into education policy or go into education research. I do think this is sort of an all hands on deck kind of situation. And I promise you that this stuff is really fascinating. Just at an intellectual level, for me, doing this work over the past 5 or 6 years has been so gratifying because it's just really interesting stuff. So I encourage you to go to that reading list and dig in. It's just a fascinating topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. I just want to say from all the people at the Institution for Social and Policy Studies there, I've said the name of the center that I direct. I'd like to just thank you so much. You've spent the day here meeting with faculty and students, and everyone I've spoken with has been really inspired by hearing about all the things that you've done and all of your insights into this important social problem. So let me just say thanks again to the audience. Thanks for everyone for attending and for your excellent questions. Tremendously grateful to you for your time, Emily, and Eric, my good friend Eric. Thank you for your help with the questions. It's just you're so good at this, and I really am grateful to you for agreeing to take on this responsibility and doing it so nicely. I encourage you to visit the ISPS website, isps.yale.edu. You can go there to keep up with all ISPS events and research and look for announcements about future events. Again, that's isps.yale.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter at ISPS Yale. That's at ISPS Yale. Again, thank you all for attending. Thanks again to our incredible staff, especially Pam Green, Rick Harrison, and Kira Wishart, who helped with the arrangements associated with Emily's visit and today's webinar. With that, I conclude today's event. Have a great evening, and I look forward to seeing the participants at future